All right, so in the previous lecture, we have discussed, basically, we have discussed two things. C as a function of income, and also I. Okay, so even we didn't say, okay, I is going to depend on Y, but they are going to indirectly affect Y, right? And also we say, okay, so Y equal to C plus I. Okay, and then so if we just plug these two back into this equation, so we're going to have a perfect model to understand the determination of Y. So that's what we are going to achieve in this chapter, right? Okay, so essentially this is a summary of this lecture, how inventory adjustment process move the economy to equilibrium. And why investment spending is a leading indicator. Okay, so that's the main thing we're going to discuss. Let's start with the income expenditure model. Okay. So before I show you the details of this income expenditure model, one thing I want to highlight is that in our business or in understanding the fluctuation of income, inventory plays a central role. Okay, so give you example, right? So the car dealership, let's just again use that example I just showed. So just use the previous slides. We have some space to write down. So if you go to a car dealership, okay, so the beginning the season, they have 10 cars. And then so they plan, what they're going to plan is every month, they are going to order 2 cars. This comes in, this is called plus. This is every month. Okay, they think about this is January, February, March, April, May, June, so on and so forth. All right. And so each month they are going to add 2 more cars. This is planned. Add into inventory. But then so usually they are going to sell some cars. Now consider 2 possibilities. Possibility number 1. So every month, like say in January, so they sold 3 cars. It's called negative. Okay. And the first, what does this means to the inventory? A certainty their inventory start to decline, right? So it's 10 plus 2 minus 3, so you have 9. So that's lower than where you start. Okay, but this declining in inventory, what does that mean? That means we have good sale or we have bad sale. From this example, currently you have good sale. So the demand is strong, right? So this good sale and demand strong coming from the declining in inventory. So that just tells us, oh, so we want to keep our inventory by adding more investment or by expand our production, right? So this is one scenario. The other scenario, so instead of sold 3, so we only sold 1 car. Now we start to pile up our inventory. You start with 10. So now you add 2, you sold 1 to end up with 11. So that just means the demand is very weak, right? So that's going to send a signal to the business. Also, we have add too much inventory. So we need to reduce our production. Okay, so in that sense, so this inventory, so if you look at the inventory of the business, so that's a strong signal to understand what's happening in the economy, right? So that's why we pay attention to inventory. All right. So now let me introduce this income expenditure model. To understand this model or to simplify the analysis, we are going to make a few assumptions. So the assumption follows. Number 1, essentially this assumption this assumption essentially just says we are going to focus on demand side. Okay, whenever there's a change in demand, the supply side will passively adjust by increase production or decrease production. So this is number one. Number two, essentially this just says price is fixed. Okay, so this is similar to the demand supply model we have reviewed at the beginning of the class. Okay, we just start with simple one. Price is fixed. Now, number three, this one essentially just says, for the moment, for the time being, we killed the government. Okay, there's no government in this discussion. Okay, and number four, so we are going to limit ourselves inside the domestic economy. Okay, there's no interaction with the rest of the world, no import and export. Okay, so we made these four assumptions to simplify the analysis so that we have sharp understanding of our economy. But I want to emphasize, we will lose or we are going to relax this assumption in future lectures, right? Now, with these assumptions, so we are going to see some very nice formulas, okay, or very intuitive. Let's start with this one. GDP equal to C plus I. Why? Because now G equals 0, NX equals 0, right? And then furthermore, so this equation comes from what? Comes from expenditure. So expenditure, in the sense, means we look at the GDP through the lens of expenditure, right? Because GDP is the total expenditure of the economy. So this is the first equation. Okay. Now we go to the next equation. Disposable income equal to GDP. So where we have this equation, this essentially we look at GDP through the lens of income. So this GDP through the lens of expenditure, right? So now we go to next step. So this is what we learned in previous lecture, right? So we have this consumption function. Okay, so the consumption function says the aggregate consumer spending will be proportional to aggregate income. And this MPC tells us their relationship. And also you have autonomous spending. All right, so this is the third equation. Now, for the moment, we assume planned investment spending is fixed. All right, so this is something you plan, how many inventory you're going to add. Okay, so this is fixed. So, and then we add them together. So we are going to have AE, which is equal to C plus I, right? A aggregate expenditure, this planned aggregate expenditure equal to C plus planned investment. But remember, so this C is going to be function of income, right? So it goes here, function of income. And income as a function is equal to GDP, right? So in that sense, okay, so on the right-hand side, so this is going to depending on disposable income. Left-hand side aggregate expenditure, but that's essentially GDP. But as you look at GDP through the lens of expenditure, this is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, so you're going to decompose this expenditure. But this expenditure is going to depend on disposable income, but the disposable income is also GDP, right? So now we end up with this equation here. Okay, and on the left-hand side, it's GDP. On the right-hand side, it's also GDP. Number one, so we have an equation to determine GDP is number one. Number two, left-hand side, we look at GDP through the lens of expenditure. Right-hand side, so we just realize GDP as income. So this is income. So that's why we are going to call this model income expenditure model to understand the determination of total GDP, but certainly this is in short run. Okay, but also through the lens of demand. That's what we are going to do. All right. Okay. So now let's look at this example. Okay, through the lens of this example, we understand what we discussed in previous slides. Okay. Let's try to make sense of this table. So first column is real GDP. Now the real GDP is going to equal to disposable income, right? Okay, so the disposable income must equal to real GDP, this by construction, because we can look at the GDP through different aspects, right? So this by construction. Now, how we end up with this column? So this column coming from this equation. Give you an example. So if your disposable income is 0, then you plug in here. So now 300 plus 0.6 times 0, so I'll give you 300. Okay. If you have disposable income of 500, so then 300 plus 0.6 times 500. Okay, so that's equal to 300. So the total is going to be 600. Right? So that's how we get column 3. I planned it, as we said earlier. So this is going to be fixed. It's always equal to 500. Now the last column, planned aggregate expenditure. So that's going to be, let me just erase here, the summation of these two. Okay, so you can 300 plus 500 give you 800. 2400 plus 500 and give you 2,900. Right? So this is how we make sense of this table. Right? So I just show you the relationship between real GDP, disposable income, C, planned investment, and planned aggregate expenditure. Right? So this is the first step. Now in the next step, so we are going to see what happens in equilibrium. Or in other words, what determines the level of real GDP in this economy. All right, let's go step by step. So next, so I'm going to use a graph to present the table we just discussed. So this consumption function. So this consumption function comes from here. Right, let's go back here. So C equal to, right? So that just means, okay, so you have interception, 300. You have a slope, 0.6, right? So they're just coming from the consumption function. Now, we are going to add, so yeah, by the way, this is here, okay? So we will add the planned investment. And the planned investment, so let's give you the vertical difference between these two lines. Or in other words, we just move off the consumption function by the amount of planned investment. And then what is the amount of planned investment from the previous slides? It is 500, right? So then we just move up this straight line, the consumption function, by exactly 500. And then, so we end up with this aggregate planned expenditure function, right? So this line, this is how we end up with this line. Now we bring these things together. Okay, so this this line actually represent this column, and actually, so this is how this column adjust with this column, right? Now, if we inspect this table, this table. Okay, so you should notice there is only one row. Okay, in this particular row, you're going to see real GDP equal to aggregate planned expenditure. There's only one row, right? So now we need to understand what would happen. So by the way, this is this row, in this row. Okay, and in this row, so we have real GDP, let's call it Y, equal to disposable income, and also equal to aggregate expenditure. Right? So now we need to understand what would happen if we above this row, or conversely, if we below this row, what would happen? All right, so that's what we need to find out. Now, let's start with above. So if we are in the second row, what this means? This means we believe or we expect the real GDP is 500. So that means the income will be 500 because GDP equal to income or income equal to GDP. Now with 500 billions of income, the consumption function will tell us the households are going to spend 600. And we knew the investment spending will be 500. So that just means, okay, so households are going to planning to spend 1.1 trillion. Now, you have a problem. So the demand, let me write it here, demand equal to 1.1 trillion. So the output equal to 0.5 trillion. What this means? So this means we underestimate. This means the demand exceeds the supply. This means we are going to lose our inventory very quickly. And in the language of the early example, this means, okay, so we plan to add 2 cars every month. But now every month, we cut a deal to sell 5 cars. So that just means every month we are going to lose 3 new inventories, right? So that just means our inventory keep declining. We cannot keep up with the demand. Okay, so then what next? What next means, or what I'm trying to ask you is, what do you think the business is going to do? Are they going to increase the production or decrease the production? So that's a question. The answer is obvious, right? So they want to increase production because so the inventory cannot keep up with demand because the demand exceed the added inventory investment. Okay, or because the demand cannot be satisfied by your supply. All right. So they want to increase production. So that goes to this direction, this direction. Right. Now we go to the other side of the story. So this is a cutoff. So we just look at above. Now let's say, for example, the adjustment is too aggressive, or we start with a very optimistic view. Say, for example, we start with this row. We are expecting the GDP is going to be 3 trillion. Income will be 3 trillion. And then the consumption function tells us households is planning to spend 2.1 trillion. And then we know the investment spending will be 0.5 trillion. And then the total aggregate expenditure will be planned at 2.6 trillion. Now, demand equal to 2.6, Y, which is output or supply, equal to 3.0 trillion. And then obviously we produce too much. Obviously, so we are going to add up our inventory, right? So in the language of this car dealership, it just means, so we plan to add 2 cars every month. Now every month we only manage to sell 1 car. So then so you can see the inventory start to pile up. Okay, so this is a bad sign. So that means we overshoot. And then the business will adjust by reduce their production. Or in this line, in this table means we are going to move up. Right? And then until we reach this particular line here. Once we are in this line, the GDP equal to disposable income, and the expenditure equal to GDP. That means any planned expenditure will find a supply. At the same time, any supply can meet with a potential expenditure. So then we are in equilibrium. Right? So actually next slide summarize what we just discussed. Okay. So basically the planned aggregate expenditure spending, which is AE. So they may not equal to Y. If they are not equal to Y, that just means you have unplanned inventory. Like in the previous example. So if we are in this region, you are losing your inventory, meaning your I unplanned is negative. Right? Because you cannot satisfy the demand. You're losing your inventory every month. On the other hand, if we are in this region, and then so you have I is positive. Okay, so you don't have enough demand. So you start to accumulate piles of inventory. Right? So this is what happens. Now, there are 2 scenarios. If firm overestimate sales, the I planning will be positive, but then the way they adjust is going to reduce. On the other hand, if they underestimate, and this number will be negative, so this positive is negative, right? So now let's look at a practice question so that we can reinforce what we just learned. Let me give you 30 seconds. All right, so let's look at this together. Suppose the level planned aggregate expenditure in the economy is 500. Real GDP is 600. So what this means? So this means, so you supply more than demand. You overestimate, right? So that just means, so you're going to add some unplanned inventory. So that just means the unplanned inventory will increase. Okay, so to link to the earlier example, the essential just says, okay, so you are expecting the sale is very strong, but turns out it was weak. Okay, so, and then you can't sell the car you ordered in every month. Okay, so and then so you're gonna have a increase in unplanned inventory, right? Okay, very good. So we can add them together. Okay, so we should look at, we start with this equation. GDP equals C plus I. And then so I includes planned investment plus unplanned investment, right? Okay, so next, so we put these two terms together, we call it aggregate expenditure. This planned aggregate expenditure, right? So you can see by comparing these equations, let me just highlight, right? Left-hand side GDP, right-hand side planned aggregate expenditure plus unplanned inventory investment. And from this equation, we already knew. So GDP equal to planned aggregate expenditure if and only if this is equal to 0, right? And also mathematically, so if there are two possibilities, right? Actually 3. Okay, so if GDP equal to, and then this equal to 0. If GDP, and then that means the I unplanned is positive. You cannot sell quick enough, right? So you start pile up your inventory. Third possibility. So that means I is less than 0. So the demand is so strong, you cannot keep up with the demand. You lose your inventory, right? But then, so accordingly, the firm, they will adjust to correct their mistake. But what was the mistake? Here, in this row, the mistake was the overestimate, right? But now here, the mistake was the underestimate, right? And then, so they are going to adjust accordingly. So until we reach equilibrium. And now we are going to define the equilibrium as, so this is equilibrium. Okay. The economy is in income expenditure equilibrium when aggregate output is equal to planned aggregate spending. So, or refers to the previous slides, it just says this one equal to this one, and then we are in equilibrium. Otherwise, we are not, and furthermore, there are going to be some adjustment. All right. And also we define this equilibrium GDP, which is the level of real GDP we at that particular equilibrium. And in that particular equilibrium, real GDP will equal planned aggregate spending, right? So now we can look at the graph to understand what happened. So we start with this line, but this line comes from where? C plus planned I, okay? And C equal to these two terms, right? And this I, okay? So we have this. Next, we add this 45-degree line. But what is particular about this 45-degree line? Along this 45-degree line, everything are equal. I mean, it's a number from x-axis versus y-axis, they are equal. Or furthermore, that means along this 45-degree line, planned aggregate expenditure equal to real GDP. Okay. So now, with the help of this 45-degree line, the cross of this 45-degree line and this line is going to give us the equilibrium. Right? So because this equal to each other, and also this AE is given by here. Right? So this is how we define this equilibrium. Now, next step, so we are going to study graphically what will happen if we are not in these stars, right? Think about if we start with here. So what that means? That means we overestimate, right? So we overestimate, and then, so by the way, so with this 3,000, sorry. Yeah, I should say we start with here, okay? So we start with 3,000. We overestimate the same thing, right? Because this is 45-degree line is here. Right? So we are here, we overestimate, but with 3,000 of real GDP, and then so you applying this formula, so you're going to get something here, right? So this is your aggregate expenditure, but it's planned, and then you're going to see there's a gap, right? So actually, so we have some numbers. Okay, sorry. Let's erase what I just wrote. So it's better use the number on this slide. So if we start with 2.5 trillion, by the way, this is a billion. So 2,500 billion is 2.5 trillion. So if we start with 2.5 trillion, so this is your estimation. This is what you are thinking, what the GDP will look like. So implies what the disposable income will be. But with disposable income of 2.5 trillion, so that implies, so first that implies, okay, so I don't have the exact number, but we can calculate easily, okay? So that's give you the aggregate expenditure. But then you can see there's a gap between the aggregate expenditure, this plan, there's a gap between these number and your total GDP. And the gap here, you can see is positive. So that just refers to the earlier example said, so you produce too much. So your inventory start to pile off because you cannot sell quick enough, right? So if that is the case, so first of all, you have positive unplanned inventory investment. Simply just tells you, so you can't get rid of your inventory quick enough. You cannot sell quick enough. You overestimate. Okay, but given this positive unplanned inventory investment, so that's going to send a signal to the business. So we have been overestimating our economy. So we need to adjust. So we need to move to this direction. We need to reduce our production. We need to reduce our real GDP, right? So on the other hand, so if we go too far, we become underestimate the production. So we produce 1 trillion, that's 1 trillion. With this 1 trillion, you're going to see the planned aggregate expenditure will be 1.4 trillion. So now with 1.4 trillion of demand, you are losing your inventory very, very quickly. Okay, so this is similar like what happening in our economy during the pandemic. Right, so you may have that experience. It seems that almost everything is out of stock, particularly the electronics, cars, right? Even house, they are out of stock very quickly, right? So, but the current pandemic has different reason. But so the picture looks similar. So we have a negative unplanned inventory. So this existence of negative unplanned inventory send the business a signal, send the economy a signal. So we have underestimate. We could not keep up the pace with the demand. To resolve the issue, to correct our mistake, we need to move to the right-hand side. We need to increase our production so that we can satisfy the need. All right? So you can see there's adjustment. So at the end, once we reach this point, and we call this Keynes cross. But apparently from this name, you can see this name after John Maynard Keynes. So he was considered as the founding father of modern macroeconomics, right? So we have reviewed that. So before he invented this theory, so no one really understood what happens to macroeconomy, right? So remember, so I talked about Hooverville. We talked about President Hoover made a mistake, right? So actually now we are getting the heart of Keynesian macroeconomics. But the first things first, so essentially demand determines our GDP. All right, okay. And then so once we in this Keynesian cross, so actually, so this is in the income expenditure equilibrium. Once we in this equilibrium, you can see every production will find the demand. Every demand will find the production. So the inventory investment, the unplanned inventory is zero. There's no surprise. So the car dealership brings 2 cars every month. So they're going to find the 2 sellers. No surprise. So every month, 2 people walk in, has the intention to buy a car, so they will get car. No surprise. There's no surprise to supplier. There's no surprise to households. Okay, so we are exactly meet with each other, and we in this equilibrium. All right. So now let's use an example to understand this Keynes cross or this income expenditure model. Okay. So let me give you 30 seconds to read this part, and then we go through all together. All right, give you 30 seconds. All right. So we have this diagram. So this is a diagram we just discussed. Now suppose this economy currently is at point B. So there are following questions. Question number one, is point B at equilibrium or not? It's not, right? So in point B, what happens? In point B, AE plan is greater than real GDP. So this means you have, what do you have? You have a positive, that's called positive I unplanned. Oh, apologize, so negative. You have a negative I unplanned. Why it is negative? Essentially, your expenditure or demand exceed your output, right? So the production cannot satisfy the need. So you are running out of your inventory quicker than you expected. So you have a negative unplanned inventory. This is like use the earlier example. This is like, okay, so we plan to bring 2 cars every month. But turns out, so there are 4 deals called every year, every month. You have to run, you're running low of your inventory. You have a negative unplanned inventory. You lose the inventory very quickly. You underestimate the demand. So this is point B, right? So in other words, B is not in equilibrium. Now, this question also asks you to describe what is happening to inventory and production in Atlanta if we in a B. So first we know, so you have a negative I unplanned. You underestimate. But what happened next in terms of production? So then the business will keep up their pace, right? So they're going to produce more so that they can satisfy the unmet demand, or to get rid of this negative unplanned inventory investment, right? So the production is going to increase. So this is what happens at point B. Now, part B, what level of GDP will this economy produce at equilibrium? So that's very simple. So they cross each other, or at the point when Y equal to AE plan. All right? So then that means C, point C is an equilibrium. Okay, next one. At what level of GDP is unplanned inventory investment is positive? So it is positive usually means the demand is weaker than production, right? You can't get rid of your inventory quick enough. You start to pile up your inventory. So that's what it means you have a positive unplanned inventory investment. Or in other words, this just essentially says Y exceed aggregate expenditure. You have positive. Okay, and then so in this graph, point D, certainly you have Y is exceeding aggregate expenditure. Point E also exceeding, Y exceeding planned aggregate expenditure, right? So hence the answer for C, part C is any point this side, you have a positive unplanned inventory investment. Means you produce too much, means you overestimate, means you will start to piling up your inventory investment. Okay, now goes to the last part. At what level is planned aggregate expenditure greater than income? B, you have aggregate expenditure greater than income. This is above 45-degree line. A, you have aggregate expenditure above 45-degree line, right? So actually the answer is any point to the left-hand side of Y2. You have planned aggregate expenditure exceed income, but this is equal to GDP. Right? So add one more little things. So if we are in this region, okay, let me just repeat myself what I said earlier. You have negative unplanned inventory investment, right? Simply because aggregate expenditure exceed production, right? So the details are listed in, answer in this slide, right? So if you're not clear, so you can read this part, okay? Now, we understand this Keynes cross. Now we understand this income expenditure model, right? So next, we are going to see what caused the change in this equilibrium, in this framework. But usually this means we need to understand what caused the shift of the planned aggregate spending line. So go back to the previous slides. So you can see this is a Keynes cross. So if this line for some reason move up, what this means? This means we are going to see a different equilibrium point, or we are going to have a different Keynes cross. On the other hand, if this curve move down for some reason, you're going to see another one. Clearly, it's different from this one. Then there are two questions. Question number one, what caused this curve shift up or shift down? This question number one. Question number two, so that's the next step. So once we move down or move up, what is going to be the impact on real GDP? Okay, so these are two questions. Let's go slowly or step by step. Step number one, what caused this planned aggregate spending line to shift either up or down? Usually this is caused by the following two reasons. Okay. The first one, if there's a change in interest rate, which is remind yourself. So interest rate essentially is what? Is the cost of investment. So if interest rate decline, the cost of investment will decline. What happens to investment? Will increase, right? So if the investment increase when interest rate decline, what that means to the planned aggregate spending line? That will increase or move up. On the other hand, if interest rate increase, then the cost of investing will increase. And then consequently, so the planned aggregate spending will push down. It becomes more expensive to invest, right? So this is the first factor. Now the other factor is change in wealth. What is changing wealth? Right? Like this background picture shows in 2007, 2008, the housing market collapsed. Then, so most people lose their wealth. So if you change if there's a loss in your wealth, either through housing market or through stock market, how would that affect your consumption? So usually your consumption will increase if you become wealthier. Now, this just implies the aggregate expenditure is going to increase because this is a summation of C plus I. Right? So these two reasons, that's the two possible source of factors that cause the shift of the planned aggregate spending line. Right? So this is going to lead to the curve to shift up and shift down. Right? All right. Now the second question, because I just imposed two questions. Question number one, what caused the curve shift up, shift down? Question number two, so if the curve shift up or shift down, right? And then so what would be impact on the total GDP? Okay, so now let's use this table to understand its impact. All right. So we start with the first two columns. And these two columns show us how aggregate expenditure will adjust with real GDP. Okay, just remind you, so this one is right here. A or yes, A plus right? So this is aggregate C. This is I. Okay, so this column. So clearly, so increase in real GDP, increase aggregate expenditure. Now, if we look at it, these first two columns, we can easily spot the Keynesian cross. Or we can easily spot the level of real GDP in equilibrium. Okay, which is this row, right? Okay, this is the first step. Now let me erase everything. Only leave this part. This is coming from this two column. Now, for some reason, the curve shift. Now we shift to this column. First, we need to identify this curve shift up or shift down. So if we compare these two columns, you can see the curve shift up. And shift up by how much? So you compare the number, compare the number. All right? So this curve shift up by 400. Right? Because if you use 1200 divided by minus 800 equals 400. 1511 is 400. So on and so forth. This 400. So the curve has been shifted off by 400. Okay. Now, under this new planned aggregate expenditure line, what is the equilibrium level of real GDP? So we compare this column versus this column. And then we find out, so this row is a new equilibrium, right? Or in other words, if the aggregate expenditure line move up by 400. The real GDP will increase by, so you compare these two numbers, increase by 1,000. Okay, can we see that? Okay, so repeat. So here, so you increase from this one to this one. The aggregate expenditure line increased by 400. But its impact on the real GDP is more than 400. The real GDP increased from 2,000 to 3,000. Real GDP increased by 1,000. Okay. Now we answered the second question, right? So again, repeat. The first question is, what caused the curve to shift up? There are two reasons. One, change in interest rate. Two, change in wealth. This is the first question. Question number two. So if the curve shift up or shift down, what is the impact on the level of real GDP in equilibrium? Now, through this example, we know the answer. Usually, it's larger than the shift in the aggregate expenditure line, right? Because look at here. So the aggregate expenditure shift off by 400, but its impact on real GDP is 10,000. So this is the second question. Now we have additional questions. Why? Or what is behind the difference? Clearly, there's like magnifying impact, right? So your consumption increased by 400, but your real GDP increased by 1,000. Okay, so that's the third question. Now, before I give you the answer, so we look at this diagram. So hopefully we see some clues. Okay. So this is the aggregate expenditure. This is before we change. And then it's crossed with the 45-degree line. We have the initial equilibrium, which is 2,000. Okay. Now, for some reason, and obviously, so either interest rate decline or wealth increase. So the curve shift off. The curve shift off by 400. All right. So now, what happens in equilibrium? So now you will notice the equilibrium becomes 3,000. Okay. So again, just highlight the number. So this increased by 400, but here increased by 1,000. Okay, so clearly there's a multiplier. Actually, I already give you the hint. What is a multiplier? Right. So consumption increased by 400, but the GDP increased by 1,000. So this is exactly because of the multiplier. This is exactly because in macroeconomy, households, business, they are interconnected. So if I increase my consumption by 400, so this is going to be somebody else's income. Someone who received this 400 is going to increase their consumption by how much? By MPC. That's what we discussed earlier, right? And then, so the amount I spend, which is MPC times 400, will become third person's income. And this third person is going to keep moving the table, right? So this is exactly the multiplier. Okay. But at the end, so you can see the change in GDP equal to multiplier times change in aggregate expenditure, right? And this multiplier in this case equal to 2.5. But this is linked with your MPC, right? Okay. And this helps us to revisit the concept of the paradox of thrifty, right? So essentially in macroeconomics, individual, they are not isolated. They are linked together through the MPC, through the relationship between income and expenditure, right? So I have $1 spending. This $1 spending must become somebody else's income. And then so because of the MPC, somebody else received this $1, will spend some out of this $1. Okay? And then so because the economy is interconnected, so someone who spent a fraction of this one income that is coming from me will have impact on the third person and so on and so forth. All right? And then, so this paradox of three-phase tells us in the individual level, it might be rational for you to reduce the consumption. But however, if I reduce my consumption due to the fear of recession, but that's going to have a domino impact on our macroeconomy. Because I reduce my consumption, somebody is going to lose their income or the potential income. And then, so somebody who loses the potential income will cut consumption. So that's going to lead the third person to lose potential income. Right? So you can see there's the chain impact. Right? So from an individual point of view, it is rational for me to cut my spending. But in the aggregate or in macro level, so we are going to see a cascading impact. So that's going to reduce the aggregate economy. All right. And here we can look at the actual data, right? So to see the leading indicator of inventory, sorry, the role of leading indicator inventory has played, right? Look at here. So first you can see the economy is changing, right? So here, so you have negative. This is real GDP. And then, so you can see the inventory start to, there's like a negative inventory. Oh, by the way, maybe we can look at it here. Okay, so here, so the economy is rebound. So the GDP increase, consumption increase, or expenditure increase. And then immediately you can see the inventory is negative. So essentially, so the production can satisfy the demand, right? So in that sense, inventory is a leading indicator for the direction of our macroeconomy, okay? So to finish this part, let's look at this case study. In 2009, the US economy was in the nosedive. So this means, so economy was in a sharp decline or in a recession, big recession. Okay, so the GDP is declining, unemployment rate is increasing. Right, so this is what happens in US economy in 2009. Now at that point, there was a discussion. Should we bail out, I mean the government, should the government to bail out GM or not? So the proponent that advocate of the bailout of GM believe the GM's problem is not self-made. Their problem is largely because it was a victim of a poor economy. Okay, what that means? That just means, okay, so GM, so they have, look at it here. So this is their sale. So there's a collapse of their sale, right? But then so those proponents of this bailout says, okay, so the collapse is not because of their poor management. Instead, this is because the poor macro economy. But now at this point, I hope we can have a better understanding. So basically it says, okay, so because of the sharp recession and many people lose their job or have a smaller income. And then in the economy wise, everyone want to cut their spending. And usually they start with big ticket items like a car, like a house. So that just means because of the recession, households reduce the purchase of a car. And certainly the GM, they are going to suffer from this big recession. And so that's the proponents, why they say we need to build out GM. That's just part of the argument. And furthermore, the other side of the story is, so if we don't build out GM, you're going to see this cascading impact keep moving. Why? Because if we don't have GM, so they have a collapse in their sales. Look at here, the sales collapsed by more than 40%. So that means GM if GM want to survive, they must lay off, right? Even or if they don't lay off, but eventually they're going to bankrupt. If they bankrupt, they're going to have more people lose their job, right? So if GM failed without help from the government, so that company itself is going to lead a vast amount of unemployment. This is like new unemployment. So then those people lost their job, and then they are going to cut their spending. If they cut the spending, so that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the rest of the economy. So that's why people advocate we should build out GM, and GM is too big to fail. It's too big in the sense, if they fail, there are millions of people will lose job. It's too big to fail in the sense, once these millions of people lose their job, so it's going to have a ripple effect on the economy, right? So to understand the impact of the bailout, give you some numbers, okay? So in 2009, okay, that's at the worst day of the recession, the unemployment rate in state of Michigan, that's where GM is headquartered, or most of the manufacturers happen in Michigan. In 2009, the unemployment rate in Michigan was 14%. Okay, as a comparison, the national average is around 10%. State of Nebraska is around 4%. Right? Now, with the help of the government, in 2016, the unemployment rate of state of Michigan went down to 4.5%. This is one number I want to share. The other number, so at the end, the Congress decided to bail out GM. So they sent $50 billion to help them. And in just a few years, they have paid back 40 billion. But also the unemployment rate was pick up, or stop, or the employment pick up very quickly. Okay? So that's kind of explain to this multiplier. Right? Okay. So this is for this chapter. So now we are going to move to next one. We are going to